Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. My name is Michael Kugelman. I'm the South Asia Associate with the Wilson Center's Asia program. Wanted to extend a particular welcome to those watching our live webcast. There are people in Bangladesh and elsewhere around the world and in this country tuning in, so welcome all. Today's event could not have come together without the help of a lot of people. First, I'd like to recognize our Wilson Center co-sponsors. These would be the Environmental Change and Security Program, and particularly Jeff DeBelco, who I saw before. He'll be up here. There he is. Thank you, Jeff. He'll be up here a bit later, as well as his colleagues Megan Parker and Kaylee Ober. Also wanted to thank the Comparative Urban Studies Project, and especially Lauren Hertzer. The Asia program has done a number of collaborations with these two Wilson Center departments in recent years, most of them on Pakistan, and it's not coincidental that these collaborations have constituted some of our most successful work, so it's always great to be working with them. I also wanted to acknowledge three other people not associated with the Wilson Center who have provided invaluable advice and assistance. They, like me, very much want Bangladesh to feature more prominently in Washington debates. These are Cynthia Bunton, who is here. Thank you, Cynthia. As well as Mohayuddin Haider, the University of Maryland College Park, as well as Fahim Haider, a writer and an artist in New York. And no one needs to hear me say that climate change is one of the great challenges of the 21st century. This summer, the UN Secretary General referred to climate change as a, quote, real threat to international peace and security. And Bangladesh is at particular high risk and is arguably one of the world's most environmentally vulnerable nations. It's a lower riparian, it is low-lying, it is populous, it is impoverished. It is a country that for its entire existence has been susceptible to natural disaster and to flooding. One can even argue that Bangladesh's very formation is tied to some extent to environmental calamity. A typhoon in the Bay of Bengal killed hundreds of thousands of people in what is now Bangladesh back in 1970. Some people believe that an insufficient response from West Pakistani authorities strengthened the insurgency in East Pakistan that would eventually bring about a new Bangladeshi state in 1971. The UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change forecasts some very bad news in the country by 2050. 2 to 3 feet sea level rises, the destruction of a fifth of the country's landmass, displacement of at least 20 million people. This is why environmental security in Bangladesh deserves so much attention, and the Wilson Center this afternoon will try to stimulate some debate, some much needed debate, by looking at population pressures, resource constraints, and climate change in Bangladesh and how these all contribute to vulnerability. And I would offer one note of caution. Climate change is clearly a major concern and we need to be worried, but at the same time, I think it's important that we not overreact and that we keep things in perspective. Should recall that back in 2005, a UN climate body projected that there would be 50 million climate refugees worldwide by 2009, 50 as in 50. However, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees has now admitted that this has not happened, particularly as according to the UN, there were only 15 million refugees of any kind in 2009. So that said, you should have a conference agenda in front of you. Our first panel will look in particular at manifestations, drivers, risks, implications of environmental insecurity in Bangladesh. Our second panel perhaps will be a bit more forward-looking, examining some possible ways to overcome the challenges. There will be a 15-minute break between panels, and let me emphasize that the importance of returning to this room after 15 minutes is almost as acute as the level of environmental insecurity in Bangladesh. You really need to get back in here to keep things moving along. So with that, let's begin with this first panel. We're going to be hearing from three speakers, all of very different backgrounds, interesting experiences. First, we're going to be hearing from Ali Riaz. He's a professor and chair of the Department of Politics and Government at Illinois State University. He's taught at universities in England, South Carolina, and Bangladesh. He's also worked as a BBC journalist, incidentally. His publications include a chapter in a very relevant volume for this forum called Climate Change and National Security, a country-level analysis. He's written the Bangladesh chapter. We'll next hear from Mohammed Kalakuzaman, who, for the sake of brevity, fortunately goes by Kalak, if I'm not mistaken. He's a professor in the Department of Geology and Physics at Lock Haven University of Pennsylvania, where his interests include coastal environmental oceanography and hydrogeology. He's also served as an assistant professor at Georgia Southwestern State University, and he's been a geologist at several institutions, including in Bangladesh. And then finally, we'll be hearing from Adnan Morshed, who's an associate professor here in town at Catholic University for the School of Architecture and Planning. He is a practicing architect. He's designed buildings all over the world, including here in Bangladesh. He's published prolifically, and he's currently at work on a book manuscript called Dhaka Delirium, which looks at urbanization in Bangladesh's capital. So with that, I will cede the floor to our first speaker, Ali Riaz.
Thank you, Michael, and it's great to be back to Wilson Center, of course, and good to see so many people interested in Bangladesh a couple of years ago. I wish we were meeting for a positive note on Bangladesh rather than what we exactly are doing now, looking at not exactly a very positive one, rather a grim picture. I'm putting up these two tables. Hopefully, in some ways, I'll refer back to them later. Before I make my arguments, I would rather like to remind 4 points. First one, Michael has referred to already about the topography of Bangladesh. That we need to keep in mind, particularly that mean elevations range from less than 1 meter in tidal floodplains, between 1 and 3 meters in the main river, and up to 6 meters in the Sylhet Basin in northeast. Of course, there is a dominance of floodplains in Bangladesh. The situation worse for the country in general, and particularly the poorer segments of the society. The coastal area in the country, particularly 710-kilometer long fringe zone of the Bay of Bengal, which are considered as most at risk. So the first point that I will ask you to remember throughout and of course throughout the whole day's presentations, is the topography of Bangladesh. The second thing, particularly when we are looking at the national security issue, is pretty familiar to anyone who observes Bangladesh, but just a reminder that the Bangladeshi political landscape, security of course involves the political landscape of Bangladesh. And as I see it, the defining characteristics of Bangladeshi political landscape is the dominance of 2 political parties, but with a growing proliferation of Islamist forces, both legitimate and clandestine. Center point is the weak institutionalization of democracy, acrimonious relationship between these 2 prominent political parties, being the Awami League and the BNP, and endemic corruption have contributed to the political instability since 1991. I'm not saying it didn't contribute before 1991, but the high hopes of 1991, the democratic era, which actually quite unceremoniously ended in 2007, as we all know. We came back again in 2009, but the reforms that was necessary, at least in my understanding, that didn't take place. And indications are very high or clear as to the return of that instability that Bangladesh experienced between 1991 and 2006. So political instability is a part of these arguments. The third point is, how would we define security? Again, mostly it is defined as traditional and non-traditional. Within the frame of traditional security, as we know, it is the geopolitical terms confined in the relationship among nation-state dealing with military strategy. That's pretty much the nutshell of very traditional concept of security. The concept of non-traditional security is less specific, as we know, but underscores the importance of human security and food security. In short-term, non-traditional security issues are challenges to the survival and well-being of peoples and states that arise primarily out of non-military sources, climate change being one of them. my opinion is that these two dimensions of security, the traditional and non-traditional security, should not be seen as completely unrelated, two separate domains. And I've always argued that threats may emerge, which is called traditional security threats, may emerge from what we usually consider as a non-traditional security issues, and vice versa. It can go other way too. So in my understanding, the national security, or at least the way I would rather like to approach it, is a combination of both these traditional and non-traditional security threats. So any risk assessment, whether it is done for a very typical traditional military strategy or it is done for the food security, has to take into these two dimensions and must be considered that these are having some sort of a what I would call symbiotic relationship. The fourth point before my argument is the trend in terms of the climate changes is discussed in different studies in different time frames in mind. Projected impacts vary accordingly, but all point to similar sort of conclusions, which Michael has summarized quite well at the beginning. But in making my arguments, what I'm doing is taking 2030, which is not that far. We are talking 2011 pretty much. So I'm talking about 19 years or so projection. That is the outer limit for anticipated climate change that I've used. I would say it's an immediate term. Definitely it's not a long-term projection or assessment. I've drawn data from two sources, mostly the hypothesis that came out of IPCC Working Group 2, particularly its overall scenario in regard to South Asia, presented in the fourth IPCC report. That is the key reference point for my presentation. Second set is the country level data, particularly temperature vulnerability, freshwater availability, and sea level rise. These are the three indicators I've used. All of them actually, the source that I've used is Center for International Earth Science Information Network. And these are the two tables that I put out there to show basically these three areas that I'm talking about: temperature vulnerability, freshwater availability, and sea level rise. Now, going back to what are my central arguments in terms of the relationship between national security and the climate change. Number one, usually in any situation, environmental state produces two kinds of negative responses: fight, that means conflict or external aggression, and flight, that is emigration. In Bangladesh, the most likely effect of these changes would be flight rather than fight. The flight option, that is immigration option, would take place at two levels: rural-urban migration at the domestic level and migration out of the country, particularly to neighboring India. The finance minister of the country in December 2009, ahead of the Copenhagen summit, said, and I quote, "Up to 20 million Bangladeshis may force to leave the country in the next 40 years because of climate change." We may disagree on the number, but there would be a migration that is pretty much sure. These two trends, domestic and international migration, have already been underway for decades, but the process is expected to accentuate as more natural calamities affect a large number of people. As for the urban-rural migration or rural-urban migration, this will be due to the decline, in my argument, agricultural productivity and sea level rise. Although there has been significant diversification of the economy in the recent years, the country still depends heavily on agriculture. About 22.7% of GDP is dependent on agriculture, pretty much close to 1/4. And the 2030 scenario, that's the hypothesis that I'm working on, in regard to the impact of temperature vulnerability and freshwater availability on agricultural productivity, is described as moderate. At this point, 2030 is moderate, but if you extrapolate it to 2050, it no longer remains moderate, even within the moderate scenario. And if we take the growing population into consideration, with a present rate of 1.88%, the figure is going to be reaching close to 229 million by 2030. Okay, again, if you are not exactly specific of 229.7 million, even close to 200 million is going to be a serious issue. And lack of substantive diversification of the economy, and if it continues to rely on agriculture, both on medium and long term, this This is going to be a major issue. This point should be juxtaposed with the fact that 56% of current food production, 30 million tons per year, comes from irrigated agriculture. Now, if there is a freshwater availability, water become a scarcity, irrigation is going to be affected, however we see it. So here we are talking about 56% of current food production. The impact of water scarcity will have an immediate and direct impact on the irrigation and therefore agricultural productivity. Due to the absence of non-farm activities in the rural areas, an out-migration will be unavoidable. In any case, if we look at the Bangladesh scenario currently, in the rural areas, non-farm activities are not very high. And then, now if we see that due to lack of or scarcity of water, the agricultural productivity is going to be less, that means it's going to generate less number of work, meaning it will force people to move out of the rural areas. It's not a choice any longer because they will have to survive. And it's a sheer survival tactics that is going to work here. The southern coastal zone will be affected by any substantial rise in sea level. The country has 710-kilometer long coastal zone. According to the government's coastal zone policy, 19 districts out of 64 are in coastal zone, covering a total of 147 upazilas or sub-districts in the country. 12 of the 19 districts border the sea or the lower tidal estuary. 48 upazilas are officially classified as exposed coastal zone and a total of 99 as interior coast. All these 147 upazilas will be affected by sea level rise, whether it's 1 meter or 3 meters, while the exposed zone will be the most immediately and severely affected. The inhabitants of the coastal zones of the south amount to 1% of Bangladeshi population, that is 1.37 million currently. This would all be affected by a sea level rise on the order of 1 meter. And if we look at this one, when we are talking about 1 meter, this is here that 1 meter low level rise would cause, in case of Bangladesh, it would be 1%. And when we are talking about Bangladesh, particularly when we are talking about water availability and other things, we cannot simply ignore the fact of India. Because when we are talking about out-migration, we are going to talk about India, which is going to be affected too. And then talking about rivers without considering China is simply meaning that we are trying to live in a paradise. Some people may call it a fool's paradise. So that's why I'm trying to bring all this information of India, China, and Bangladesh together. Though usually our consideration and discussion on Bangladesh tends to be, oh, it is a South Asian region, so we should be talking about India, Pakistan. No, when we are talking about environmental issues, especially in respect to water level, water availability, and migration, out-migration, it has to be India in the picture. So if it is at 1 meter rise, that is going to be, what, 1.37. An additional 4 million people inhabit in the 3 meter low elevated coastal zone and could be expected to suffer the effects of storm surges and other extreme weather events. And in those areas, fisheries remain the primary profession of a large number of people in the coastal zone. So any decline in fish productivity associated with the changes in the ocean temperature or currents will accelerate the hardship suffered by them. The most serious and immediate implication of this dramatic reduction of agricultural productivity and substantial decline in the fisheries will be decline and perhaps demise of the food security in Bangladesh. The decline of food security is bound to create a vast pool of disgruntled population. And this is going to add to an extant situation there. In my understanding, the extant difficult situation is the liberalization policy adopted by the governments, by the regimes, irrespective of political parties, irrespective whether it's a civilian or military regime, since late 1980s. It has already adversely impacted upon poor and rural population. The number of discontented and marginalized citizens remains significantly high. The high rate of urbanization has brought millions of people to cities which are ill-equipped to deal with this growing population and to provide services to these migrants. Many of them are poor, extremely poor. Slum dwellers have increased. Although the majority of the population still lives in the rural areas, Bangladeshi politics is dominated by this urban population. So on the one hand, we are seeing this movement to the urban cities. They're not happy being in slum. The cities are not ready to provide the services. And then a political scenario which has always been dominated by this urban population. So Bangladeshi politics is dominated by the urban population. It is not only the ruling elites are urban. The disenfranchised poor urban population has always been at the forefront of political agitation, mostly as foot soldiers in political parties. This is not a good news for the country where political parties are locked in an unending battle. Just look at the last 15, 16, 17 years. And democratic institutions are very fragile. When I'm very generous about Bangladeshi democratic institution, that much I can came up with. The newly created pool of urbanized population will have little access to services, therefore little stake in the system. Needless to say, one cannot ignore the security implication of these developments. As for the outmigration, the growing number of Bangladeshis are crossing to the border to India. I understand this is a very politically charged issue. Indian sources have claimed that as many as 15 million people from Bangladesh have already moved into India, while the Bangladeshi authorities have insisted that no migration take place. The number may be contentious, but the phenomena cannot be denied altogether. The Bangladeshi politicians, particularly the regime's consistent argument that nobody is crossing the border to India, sounds very good, but exactly not practical or realistic statement. According to UNFCCC background paper, more than 10 million Bangladeshi natives have already migrated to the neighboring Indian state during the past 2 decades. Importantly, the adaptive capacity of the Indian states, where Bangladeshi migrants are most likely to move, is not exactly very high. So they are facing their own problem, and then when these new migrants are coming in, they're not going to actually embrace them, as we have seen in Northeast India, for example, and the growing sentiment even within West Bengal, or should I call Paschim Bongo. In response to the ongoing and potential migration, the Indian government has started building this fence, 8 feet high barbed wire fence along the 2,500-mile frontier with Bangladesh. This move has not only irked Bangladeshis, but also been criticized as a close the castle gates phenomena that can easily slip into a barbarians at the gates mentality, which would be both counterproductive and lead to mounting radicalization on not only on the Bangladesh side, but of course on the Indian side as well. So there is, here you can see gradually we are moving into this so-called traditional security element of it. The second point, in the context of Indo-Bangladesh relationship, perhaps the most pressing and sensitive issue is water sharing. Popular reactions to the failure to sign a water sharing deal of Tista River during the recent visit of Indian Prime Minister to Dhaka is indicative of the sensitivity towards the issue. Bangladesh already faces serious shortages of fresh water. And again, if you look at this, the fresh water availability in case of Bangladesh is really significant, because taking the 2000, 61.8% has access to 1,000 cubic per year per capita fresh water, 64.4% has this one. There would be 2.6% changes. And now, what does that mean? Water scarcity below the notional acceptable minimum of 1,000 cubic meters per year per capita will affect an additional 2.6% of the population by 2030, meaning only in next 18, 19 years. The demand for the fair share of water from the part of Bangladesh will be louder. Lack of fresh water in the future will make it more important for Bangladesh to insist that India takes its concerns seriously. Many Bangladeshi allege that the country is deprived of its agreed share of Ganges water under the treaty signed in 1996. And now, if we take the recent statement by the Bihar's chief minister, that they are now asking to renegotiate the 1996 Ganges treaty because Bihar doesn't want to give any more water to Bangladesh. So all these will actually have impact on Indo-Bangladesh relationship. And Indo-Bangladesh relationship is not only a matter between two governments. It has a domestic political implications. Anyone in knowing about Bangladeshi politics would definitely understand that relationship between India and Bangladesh is pretty much an issue, a dominating issue. We may not like it, but that's a dominating issue in Bangladeshi domestic politics. Finally, there's a governance issue to it, meaning that increasing frequency of natural calamities will require mobilization of funds from already meager resources available for development, social services. Preventive and preparatory measures are already costing the nation dearly. Now, when there is strain on the limited resources, it is not always shared by all segments of the society. Certain sections of the society will bear a disproportionate share of the cost. The experience of recent decades indicate that in the event of resource constraints, the state will rely on NGOs to deliver social services. In several instances, and in regard to many services, the delivery mechanism of NGOs have proved to be more effective, but the most debilitating effect is that state loses its legitimacy. Franchising things to NGO from the state, though in short time looks rosy, but over time it actually creates, the absence of state agencies creates an opportunity for the growth of parallel authority. Then going back to the fragile democratic institution, what we have seen is that when the state becomes weak, internally and externally, what it does, the capacity of the state is shrinking. They cannot deal with these things. And when the state capacity sort of reduces, tendency within Bangladeshi politics, perhaps across the board, is possible weakening of the state's capacity leads them to be more authoritarian because they cannot allow more criticism on issues, whether it is its relationship with India or whether it's failure to deliver the services and the goods that the state is supposed to do. So on the one hand, franchising things to NGOs, on the other hand, meaning the state is weakening, it is withdrawing, on the other hand, in the eyes of the people, and mostly disgruntled, migrated to urban areas, poorer segments, who are the foot soldiers, are looking at this as the state's failure. No, Bangladesh state is not going to fail. I'm not going to suggest that it's a recipe of state failure, but it is going to reduce the capacity of state to deliver. And in the event where there are fragile democratic institutions, where you can channel those discontent into the system, state tends to be very authoritarian. Bangladeshi history since 1974, whether we are reminded by the one-party system or the 15 years of military rule or even 2 years of military-backed caretaker regime and 15 years of civilian regime, not always democratic in my judgment, actually have seen or shown us that mostly state becomes very authoritarian. And in an authoritarian state, the chances of social unrest and upheaval is pretty much given. So with those kind of things, and I don't see these things, though these are, there are other factors, but one of the disruptive factor that I see in this is this climate change. And unless it is addressed in some form or fashion, it is going to, this is the scenario, this is how it is going to be played out in the next 19 or maybe 25 years or 30 years, which is not exactly something we can simply ignore. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we go to Kolak.
Can we go there?
We get a view show.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm a geologist, as Michael already introduced, and when a geologist dresses up, there is something really special going on. I like my T-shirts and jeans, but, I dressed up for the occasion. As you can see from the title, I'll be talking about geologic aspect of climate change and, what it means for Bangladesh. Bengal Delta meaning the delta region of Bangladesh and West Bengal together, actually. When it comes to climate change, it's not a news to geologists. There are a lot of climate changes back in time. What is shown here is 400,000 years history of climate change, and this is last 22,000 years of climate change. 22,000 years ago, sea level was about 140 meters below present, and obviously it has come up. This is for the sea level curve for Bay of Bengal for last 7,000 years. 7,000 years ago, sea level was about 7 meters below where it is today, 7,000 years ago. As you can see, it rose fairly quickly till 5,000 years and then kind of stabilized for last 5,000 years. And this is the sea level curve for last 150 years or so. You can see after 1930, sea level has ramped up, but all of us know that. But that is really the data from Bay of Bengal. So here is a data that we are showing. Here is the sea level curve for last 7,000 years ago. 7,000 years ago, sea level was 7 meters below present. If we look at the middle part of Bangladesh, central part of Bangladesh, the delta part of Bangladesh, sedimentation has occurred really, really fast. During last 7,000 years, in some places, sedimentation has taken place, like 37 meters of sedimentation took place in the central part of Bangladesh in 7,000 years. What does that mean? That means that sedimentation was occurring a lot faster than the sea level was rising. So, in other words, country was building by the sedimentation process, deposition process, so it wasn't a problem. Sea level rise wasn't a problem, although sea level rise was fairly rapid, as you can see from 7,000 years ago to about 5,000. This is really copied the graph from the last slide here. So I'm not going to read through all of this, especially when we are time constrained. Just to make few points. Sea level was 6 meters above where it is today, 6 meters meaning about 20 feet higher than what it is today, some 125,000 years ago. That is the last one period for our Earth history, right? So during that time, obviously, our shoreline in Bangladesh was close to Barind and the Madhupur Tract, meaning in the central part of the Bangladesh, right? So the whole of the Bangladesh in front of it was really under ocean, some 125,000 years ago. And as I said already, that during the last glacial period, sea level was more than 100 meters below present, when our shoreline was way into the ocean, meaning Bangladesh was a lot bigger country than it is today, some 16,000 years ago, and that is the case, by the way, for US also, right? So sea level was 7 meters below present, as I just mentioned a few seconds ago, and we have more sedimentation during those 7,000 years ago than sea level rose. So it isn't a problem. So relative sea level has been rising in Bangladesh from 4 to 8 millimeters per year, whereas the global average is about 1.5 millimeters per year. In other words, sea level in Bangladesh is rising fairly rapidly. Compared to other part of the world, there are a lot of reasons for that. We are not going to go in details. However, for last 200 years, or 100 years rather, shoreline was pretty stable in Bangladesh, meaning where it is, its location. For the impact of recent rapid sea level rise, as I mentioned from the 30s, and decline in the sediment flux to the coastal area, keep in mind that sediment, river-borne sediment that is brought into Bangladesh by the great rivers, all these Ganges, Brahmaputra, Meghna, and 54 common rivers, that's what really makes Bangladesh. That's what we call the country Bangladesh, by deposition of river-borne sediments. So it has changed, seems like, for the last few decades. Last few decades, I'll show you all the data, because we are obviously from the sciences data bound. We don't have any personal bias. At least we try not to have. Here is a Google map just showing the Bangladesh is here, but what influences Bangladesh is this entire region. Dr. Ria has already mentioned about India, and obviously the Nepal and China, and all of these, make what we call the Ganges, Brahmaputra, Meghna basin. That is a huge basin. Bangladesh is very much like a funnel that collects all the water and sediment and drains through Ganges and Brahmaputra and forming this delta area here. So it is not only the water that matters when it comes to Bangladesh, it's really the water and sediment management. Otherwise, we'll be in. So, just to summarize what I said so far, 125,000 years ago, shoreline was approximately here. Don't take my word for it, meaning it could have been here, could have been there, but it's a schematic, right? So sea level was here. This entire area here was under ocean, right? And then 16,000 years ago, during the last glacial period, our shoreline was here. And this is the swath of no ground. So it was really an abundant channel, a big river that is now drowned underwater. Shoreline was here. Just as the case for the US, as I said, US was a lot bigger country than it is today, 16,000 years ago. Then sea level started to rise, and we see all the evidence that shoreline was somewhere here 7,000 years ago. So 7,000 years ago, country was much smaller. However, during this last 7,000 years, you can see the most of this delta plain really grew. Although sea level was rising faster, country was growing even faster. It is because there was a tremendous influx of sediments from the Himalayas. So, and then, sea level has been, like the shoreline has been going, this way for the last 200 years. Reynolds map, 1780, shorelines are very similar to where it is today, right? For last 200 years, it was pretty stable. You can see there is this 1780, that's how the shoreline used to look like in Bangladesh. 1980, about 100 years later, you can see a lot more land grew, and you can see this chunk of land obviously came out here. You can see this here, shoreline was very much here in 1780, and 1980 shoreline is here near the eastern part of Bangladesh. So it grew almost like 50 kilometers. These are real data from the shoreline location. So for last 125 years, some areas shoreline has advanced seaward by 50 miles, right? So when it comes to sea level and climate change, we obviously have to talk about the coastal areas of Bangladesh. And coastal plain extends 35 to almost 200 kilometers, the area that get flooded, supposed to get flooded. In this zone, we have 123 polder, meaning they are the dikes, they are the embankments, they are the levees. These are those numbered levees. 32% of Bangladesh, about 46,000 square kilometer area, belong to coastal plain of Bangladesh. 28% people, close to 45 million people reside in this area. So when it comes to climate change, shoreline erosion, and we are talking about a huge number of people. Roughly speaking, consider this area very similar to Everglades in Florida. You will not put 20 million people in the Everglades, right? It will not just happen in the US, right? Or New Orleans, for that matter, very similar to our geographic condition. In fact, Bangladesh is 180 degrees on the other side of Gulf of Mexico. Very similar climate, very similar environment. But the point of it is sea level rose and went back, as I showed in geologic past. It did not really bother anyone. Now sea level is rising. It bothers because we are facing tremendous amount of people that are affected, right? That's what making all the difference. Geologically speaking, sea level will come up, go back. It wouldn't matter if no one was living there. That's how the country actually built up. But now we have to deal with 45 million people directly affected by sea level. So this is the rate, as I showed. Shoreline sea level rises towards the eastern part of Bangladesh faster than the western part, meaning Sundarbans. This is near Chittagong. So there are other processes that are important in sea level rise. I'm not going to go in details. If we extract water too much, groundwater, land sags, and relative sea level rises. The glacier melts, sea level rises, and when we have all the damming of the rivers does not put the fresh water into the coastal areas, that has the sea level rise effect more accentuated. So these are all the processes happening in our region. Some subsidence, neotectonics, some groundwater withdrawal because there are 45 million people living there, and then obviously the melt of the glaciers in the Himalayas. All of these are affecting. Even then, for until 2000, you can see Bangladesh, this is the net area, how many hectares of land Bangladesh gained from 1973 to 2000. It's about 18 square miles. So that wasn't really losing land. On average, some areas were eroding, other areas were forming. But all in all, we are pretty stable, I would say. 18 square mile is not a big area, but point of it is country was pretty stable, shoreline-wise. But things are changing now. As you can see, these are the Salinity Intrusion 67 line was the green one here, and then 97, 30 years later, Salinity Intrusion, intruded further inland. And these are all documented facts. These are the soil salinity also increasing. That's what puts the food security and everything Ali Reyes was talking about. So these are some prediction by other people, not by my study. Mohal Nasreen and a group did a study from sea. So you can see they are saying that 32 centimeter of sea level rise will push the salinity line here, and 88 centimeter would push the salinity line there. Obviously, most of the Sundarbans will be affected by then. The World Heritage Site, which is here, part of it is in India as well. Increased sedimentation, however, could counter that sea level rise. Because when sea level is rising, you need to grow the land. Delta grows seaward as sea level rises. That's just the war. All over the world, that's what deltas do. If you supply them with water and sediment, they grow seaward. That's what delta is supposed to be doing. But if you curtail the water and the sediment, then it cannot really grow. And we are doing just that. With the polders, you are isolating all these coastal plain from tidal regular inundation. That's really saying that, for a lack of a better word, if you really, neuter a dog and expect it to produce babies, it will not just happen, right? So that's exactly what is happening in Bangladesh. We are isolating all these coastal plains by the polders from the irregular natural tidal inundation, and isolating those lands and making them a bowl, like in New Orleans. So it's like, the sea level is rising, the land inside of it is not rising for last 2-3 decades, for sure, but Bangladesh likes projects, so they do this. This is just a picture of the polders, and these are the land inside. They don't get inundated unless and until there is something like Isla or Cedar, 2007, 2009. They breached through those polders, and water is stagnant still today. It's not going to go anywhere until you pump them out, right? So when you put the polder, just like my podium here, water is here outside, and my hand is below this, just like New Orleans, if you have been to that place, and water goes over the polder. They're bound to go over the polder every now and then they are just stuck there because it cannot really recede. So that is the New Orleans scenario. You can see the dike here, and the New Orleans is here, and you can see the Lake Pontchartrain level is higher than the city itself. Same thing happening in many parts of Bangladesh, including Joshua, Babadaho, and many other places. So we are permanently making those places into bowl-shaped, and things will get worse. But, and these are some scenario of sea level prediction. This is the IPCC sea level prediction. They are most conservative. They are predicting only 59 centimeter of sea level rise by the turn of the century. There are other studies who predict more than 2 meter, 200 centimeter. And if we want to be on the safe side, I think that we should really consider this 2 meter of sea level rise, during this century, 21st century. That will mean a catastrophe for Bangladesh. And 1.5 meter rise will change the configuration of Bangladesh. It will look like this, you can see. Currently it looks like this. We'll lose a lot of land. 2 meter rise in sea level will push the shoreline into Greater Sylhet and Moimansingh, and that bothers me because I come from here, from Kishorganj. So as you can see, that I have a personal reason to believe that it is going to be really problem. However, real situation is geologic reality of none of these prediction that you see, that 2 level rise of sea level shoreline will go to Sylhet or Moimansingh. All of these scenarios take like the drowned bathtub scenario, as if Bangladesh will be standing there and sea level will rise. Nothing will happen to the land itself. That is not correct. That is not right. Because sedimentation will take place at the same time. If we allow sedimentation, like it happened in the past. So it is not that Bangladesh will stand there and sea level will rise, we get drowned. Yes, we will if we isolate this land from the inundation, obviously, from sedimentation process. So we are not taking into account many studies that you hear. They don't take into account subsidence of Bangladesh, compaction of the sediment, crustal rebound due to the Himalayas, glacier is melting, so land is rising in Himalayas and coastal plain is really sinking. So we are getting a double whammy, meaning relative sea level is rising even faster because of the geologic and deprivation of sediment. We are depriving the coastal plain from sedimentation. I'm saying natural sedimentation, if we could allow and facilitate and enhance, then it could really counter some of these, offset some of the sea level rise. Most of these geologic processes are not well studied in Bangladesh. However, one thing that is missing in Bangladesh, you will not find a solid science study. People make a lot of arguments, lot of conclusions with very, very weak science, in my mind. I don't see a very solid study in Bangladesh, especially from the scientists in Bangladesh. That may be a criticism for our brethren living in Bangladesh, but that's just the reality. You will not find a solid science in Bangladesh. So this is just a scenario how things happen. This is just showing the different major rivers, how much of water they bring to Bangladesh. It's the water budget. And that's most important for me. I prepared this diagram based on the published research. 1965, total amount of sediment used to come to Bangladesh to build the land was 2 billion ton per year. And all the studies shows that currently our sediment, amount of sediment entering Bangladesh is 1 billion ton. It's 50% has been reduced over the last 40 years. Amount of sediment, not water, water and sediment. And sediment is what really makes the country, right? Not the water. So here I did some math on my own. If we will consider 1 ton of sediment coming in Bangladesh, what I'm showing here, let's say size of Bangladesh is 144,000 square mile. If we could evenly spread this, all the sediment that enters Bangladesh, then 144,000 square kilometer. So that will, if we could spread this sediment over Bangladesh, the whole of Bangladesh, then sedimentation rate would be 3 millimeter per year. Remember, if sea level rises 2 meter in this century, 3 millimeter will not really save Bangladesh. We need a lot more, right? 200 divided by 90 years that we have, for example, right? So it's going to be more. But we don't need sediment to be spread over entire Bangladesh. Let's say coastal zone. If the same amount is spread, every single sediment is captured and spread over Bangladesh, the coastal areas, that can grow the land by 9 millimeter per year. However, 1 billion ton of sediment is not 1 ton, it should be 1 billion ton. It's my mistake. 1 billion ton of sediment does not get spread over the land. 50% get lost to the swatch of no ground. All the studies indicate. Other 50%, 25% get spread over the coastal areas, other 25 floodplains and the riverbed. So let's say about 25% of total sediment, which is this curve here now, the bottom curve, right? So if we could capture all the sediment in that stage in coastal area, the land will grow only at 3 to 4 millimeter per year if we spread it over coastal plain. You get the picture. Meaning sediment we are receiving right now, if we could spread the whole thing, by capturing all the sediment, still it is not enough to counter the sea level rise. So in the past, when delta was growing at really, really fast rate, some sedimentation rate we have recorded is about 17 to 20 millimeter per year. So land was growing that fast. Now we don't have enough sediment even to grow it even 5 millimeter per year. And sea level is definitely going to rise more than vulnerable areas, as Dr. Riaz mentioned, those 48 upazilas exposed to the coastal areas. I call it vulnerable to sea level, direct vulnerable. If you spread the sediment over those areas, still that only makes 5 millimeter per year. That is if you facilitate sedimentation. What we are doing with all the projects are not facilitating sedimentation, as I mentioned. To make things worse, as you know, this is the Ganges-Brahmaputra basin. There is a Farakka barrage, there is a Tista barrage, there is a Tipaimukh proposed barrage. So that all captures not water, also sediments. And this is the Bangladesh, and this is the garland of dams around Bangladesh by India. Every single river that enters Bangladesh, 54 of them, one way or other, they interfere with them, with their flow. Meaning either it's and as I said, as a geologist, it's not just water what matters, also the sediments. So that's just the reality of Bangladesh. And these are the proposed dams in India, all around India. This is Bangladesh, right, small little country here. And these are the proposed dams. This is all from Indian studies, not my study. And as you know, China is proposing river linking to remove water from Brahmaputra. So is it really worse in water worse in Asia? That's probably true. And Bangladesh in that context, trying to do a lot of things. Bangladesh is the government document. They prepared a huge document called Bangladesh Climate Change and Sustainable Development Action Plan. In this plan, they have 9 themes. I'm not going to go over them, obviously. One that interests me most is the program number 3. They propose to repair and build new embankments. They see it as a panacea for sea level rise. Polder them, just isolate them out like Netherlands. About 7,000 kilometers of them, repair and maintenance in the embankment. And there are something they say they want to improve the drainage and river trading works. I put them in green. They are the right measure in my mind. These are no. So what should Bangladesh do? I think that carry out detailed study, as I say, study is really lacking in Bangladesh to quantify geologic processes. When you talk about delta building against sea level rise, these are all geologic processes. They are not really anything else. So we need to understand the subsidence using LiDAR data. It is done routinely in the US, everywhere. USGS can help us. Soil loss, siltation in riverbed, how fast riverbeds are silting up, compaction, and what rate sea level and coastal areas are growing or reducing, and actual rate of sea level rise. Increase domestic capability, adopt ecological approaches to water and sediments. We complain against India. That is true. They are not doing the fair to our water, for sure. But within Bangladesh, rivers are not being maintained properly either. Bangladesh has a lot to do on their own. And that is, so take up coastal land reclamation projects maybe. So here, what I'm suggesting, negotiate with India and other riparian countries for integrated water sediment resource management plan modeled after Mekong River Basin. Those who are familiar with Mekong River Basin, they do a fantastic job in collaboration. At least on paper, I see there are hundreds of publications. I wish we had at least handful of publications on Ganges, Brahmaputra, Meghna Basin together with India and Nepal and China as an integrated plan. But we don't have anything. So we need to quantify impacts of low water and sediment flow to the sea level rise. No one really has done that. If you ask them, they will not be able to show you a solid science-based work. There are a lot of great publications. So documenting the sediments, we need to quantify sediment input, output, and what is happening. And I think that dig, elevate, and dwell, in other words, dig up the river basin, elevate the land where people live in the coastal areas, and then dwell there. Our previous generation did it for hundreds of years. You dig the canals, make the villages higher, and live in harmony with the nature. All I'm saying, really, you have to understand the natural processes. You cannot defy the nature. You have to live in harmony with it. And that is the only way out. I don't think that message really gets through the policymakers in Bangladesh. They see things as a project, build, more polders, more roads, without understanding geology and understanding the natural setting. So here we go. I'm a geologist, but when I was coming here, my colleagues were telling that you're going to Washington, D.C., make sure that you don't return to us, Lock Haven, as a politician. Well, I try not to, but here I'm saying, what should Bangladesh do? Garner support among policymakers. This is not a geologist speaking now, like more of a diplomat. In a Bangladesh caucus, U.S. senators and congressmen, MPs of the European Union, politicians, and environmentalists in the subcontinent, if necessary, form an international independent study. Raise the issue at various international forums like World Bank, IMF, UNESCO, and with a target to go from potential conflict to cooperation potential. That is a real project under UNESCO. So this is how Bangladesh could reclaim some of the land by dredging offshore and building the coastal areas. This is a diagram from Netherlands. And when I came to this conference, I never saw a title of a conference with a question mark. And I like that. Perfect storm? Yes, it could be. lot of questions there. It could be a perfect storm, but it doesn't have to be. I also feel that way. It's a Denmark publication says Bangladesh is drowning. Oops, sorry. I have to go one flight back if I could. There's one slide, if I could just show, that's my mistake. That's the last one. Okay. The fate of our delta, or Bangladesh, will really depend on how effectively Bangladesh and other co-riparian nations, especially India, they manage the Ganges-Brahmaputra basin and water and sediment resources in the future. With the help of international community like this forum, for example, and by adopting ecological approach, meaning understanding what is the open approach, meaning understanding the natural setting and let the sedimentation occurs, and let the coastal areas get flooded every now and then, but people where they are living, they need to be elevated, they need to live in a higher ground. But isolating them forever, we are just making this thing worse and worse and worse, and there will not be any escape from it. So, is it a perfect storm for Bangladesh? It could be if we maintain the status quo. That definitely will lead to a perfect storm. So that is what I think. And I want to acknowledge Woodrow Wilson Center for having this opportunity. And I know that I went through many of the slides very fast because time limit is 20 minutes. At least I wanted to initiate a discussion so that, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Now, Professor Moshed.
As you might know, that there was an earthquake in Bangladesh and India yesterday, and just before I got here, I asked Michael that whether Woodrow Wilson arranged this earthquake in Bangladesh to shore up support for this symposium. Okay, I have to acknowledge that I can't possibly finish this talk in 20 minutes. So I will beg your indulgence in a very fast-paced presentation. So what I'm arguing today is that, as you can see from the title, the central threat, Dhaka as a frontier in the climate change narrative of Bangladesh. So what do I mean by that? Let me just back up a little bit. What I'm arguing is that the climate change discourse on the climate change related vulnerabilities in Bangladesh has been dominated by dominated by the specter of a southern threat. That is, that with global warming and sea level rise, a significant landmass of Bangladesh from the south will disappear underwater. So this has been as you have seen the two past presentations, and with all due respect, has been the dominant discourse in climate change as it relates to Bangladesh. And this is the southern frontier, quite logically, that most of the cyclones, most of the natural calamities attack Bangladesh from the south. So this is the most vulnerable region in Bangladesh with salinity, intrusion, and the infection of aquifers in the coastal region. It has been the dominant threat. And as you can see from the size and from this picture, you can see that that is the climate change frontier in Bangladesh, the southern coastal region. So let me just give you some simplistic math here. Bangladesh, as you would know, is a very flat deltaic plain. It's very flat. It's stunningly flat. For 1 mile, the rise of topography is 5 inches. For 100 miles, the rise of topography is 51 feet and 6 inches. So it's stunningly flat. And that's logical. That's the nature of a delta. And as you would know, Bangladesh is the largest delta in the country. But let me tell you this. For a 5-foot rise of sea level rise, and to inundate a landmass of 12.5 miles deep into the city, it would require approximately about 375 years, assuming that there are no major unexpected natural transformation or anything of that sort. And of course, this is based on the current rate of global warming and the current rate of sea level rise, which I assumed at, as you have heard from the two previous presentations. If you assume that the annual rate of sea level rise is 4 millimeter per year, it would take about 375 years to inundate an area, a coastal area that is 12.5 miles deep into the country. If you want to inundate 41 feet and 6 inches and 100 miles shoreline deep into the country, it would take about 3,080 years. So what I want to argue, rather, is that there is a greater and immediate threat that is coming not from the south, but from the from the geographic center of Bangladesh. And why so? That's happening because of this unplanned urbanization and illegal encroaching of all kinds of ecologically sensitive regions, filling of rivers, and all kinds of destruction of wetlands that has can you hear me at the back? Okay. So what I'm trying to argue is that there is a greater threat that is coming from the center of the region because of this rampant, unplanned urbanization that is destroying the ecological, that is destroying the fragile land-river ecosystem that has historically defined the deltaic plain of the country. So let me just very quickly read here. Dhaka's megalopolis juggernaut, which I call the central threat to the country's climatic, economic, and demographic stability, not only exemplifies the tragic environmental consequences of uncontrolled urbanization in Bangladesh, but also alerts us more generally to the collective urgency to view urban centers as the frontier of climate change narrative, especially in developing countries that will become urban majority by 2030.
So they won't hear you on the video unless you stay close.
Okay, all right, okay, thank you. So what I'm saying here is that if you look at this slide, Dhaka is literally the geographic center of the country, and it actually occupies a land that is very sensitive to the land-river ecology that has defined the deltaic plain of Bangladesh. So if you mess with this region, that means you are actually literally disrupting the land-river ecosystem of the country. You are destroying the rivers, and that's exactly what is happening today. And I'm going to show that I'm trying to demonstrate that through visual examples. So as you can see here, we have heard from the previous two examples, presentations, that Bangladesh is literally crisscrossed by a very powerful river system in the world. The Ganges and Brahmaputra and Meghna basin that defines this deltaic plain. But let me back up a little bit. Why am I calling the city as the frontier of climate change? As you know, urbanization is one of the most anthropogenic forces on Earth today. Cities, as you can see from here, the cities occupy only 3% of the Earth's surfaces, but it houses more than 50% of the world population. So my point here is that what goes on in cities makes a huge difference in the life of the planet. It can literally destabilize the planet if we don't treat cities well, if we don't urbanize well, and because urbanization is an inevitable process of the world now. And as you know, that 2007 is a landmark year because that's when the threshold of the world population crossed the 50% threshold, and that suggests that, as you can see from this graph, that urbanization will be the future of the planet. Urbanization will, the number of people living in cities will continue to rise as rural population will continue to decline. So this is a very simple argument that I'm trying to make, that in conventional climate change discourse, urbanization is yet to sink in. The idea that urbanization makes a huge difference in the way we talk about climate change, that needs to be taken into consideration. But that, as of now, that's not happening. Climate change discourse and urban growth, as of now, they are two distinct entities, these two distinct discourses that they must be married to for us to steward the planet to a better future. This is just to show you that urbanization, as I said earlier, that urbanization will be the future. But majority of this urban growth is not going to happen in the West or in Western metropolises. It will happen in Asia, mostly in Asia, in Africa, as you can see from here. Asia and Africa, both continents will become an urban majority by 2030. Here you can see, so coming back to Dhaka, as you can see here, 1950, New York and Tokyo, only two megacities in 1950. 1915, among the 22 megacities in the world, 12 will be in Asia, and 5 of the 10 top megacities, 5 of them will be in South Asia. So in this scenario, Dhaka is a vital concern as far as climate change is, as long as we are talking about climate change vulnerabilities. So just to give you some numbers here, urbanization in developing countries, 43% urban population in 2005 and 56% in 2030. And the population growth in Asia is predominantly happening because impoverished people are moving from rural areas to urban areas. And the reasons, as you have heard in earlier presentations, are multifaceted. Climate change refugees, people losing their lands because of land erosion, employment opportunities, the desire to have a better life. All these things are galvanizing people, or people are sort of heading to cities in order to get a better life or employment opportunities and so on. This I have already explained, that majority of the megacities will be in Asia and more so in South Asia. As of now, roughly about 32% of the population live in urban areas in Asia. So I want to make two key observations here. And cities are where climate-related insecurities could be tackled with the greatest result. With the greatest results, because as I might have told you, but 80% of greenhouse gas emissions are attributable to urban areas in the world. Most of global urban growth will transpire in developing countries in the future. So now let me bring you back to Dhaka. I want to make a few points before I actually throw some ideas how to deal with urbanization and its climate-related insecurities that we are so anxious about. Number one, I'm going to describe this very briefly in a minute, but let me just identify what are the challenges, what are the key problems that are making Dhaka, the capital, with 16 million people in an area 1,600 square kilometers, what are the issues that are making this city is extremely vulnerable for climate change, for climate change. Number one is Dhaka has evolved with a very poor, historically developed with a poor urban DNA. I'm going to explain that in a minute. That what I'm trying to say is that a kind of an agrarian society all of a sudden found itself in the late 20th century urbanizing with tremendous speed, that with so much pace that the society did not know what it meant to be urban. So, and of course, that kind of misunderstanding, that kind of confusion had tremendous social, political, climatic, and geographical implications. Population growth. It's a phenomenal growth of the city. I will tell you some of the key issues: and proliferation of slums, squatter settlements, extreme urbanism. That means a lot of people are living in extremely unhygienic, congested areas. And I'm going to explain that in a minute. And of course, these are related to social insecurities. Land grabbing. When you have a lot of people trying to occupy one city, a lot of floating people, what would they do? They would try to occupy lands. They would try to occupy any land that comes their ways. They can find. So that means that they will occupy, no matter what you tell them to, they will occupy all the ecologically sensitive wetlands. They will occupy even rivers. They will fill up rivers. They will dump industrial wastes in the rivers because of economic growth and so on. I'm going to explain that. Environmental pollution. If you have a lot of people, 16 million people, with about 40,000 people per square kilometer, you will have a tremendous waste output. It will, of course, be related to economic growth. And so we will, of course, with economic growth, if we don't manage that growth, it will also produce a tremendous amount of waste that will be just dumped in your backyard, in your rivers, and so on. Confusing land, when you have tremendous amount of people, when you have people, just to give you a sense, if you have not been to Bangladesh, just imagine this scenario. Take half the US population and corral them into a state like Wisconsin or Iowa. That would be the population density in Bangladesh. So it will, of course, create confusing land pattern. That means that in residential areas, you will have industries polluting the air and so on. And of course, the key problem of all these is the most glaring issue of all these problems is the poor governance. How do you manage urban areas? The urban governance is at the bottom of all these problems. I'm going to very briefly talk about that. So very quickly, what I was saying earlier, that Dhaka grew with a poor urban DNA. That means the kind of the infrastructures, urban amenities that you require to live in a good city, that they are absent. Why? Because Mughals from the Middle Ages, Mughals did not invest much in the infrastructure of the city, because they, if you think about the history of East Bengal, Mughals never really liked the place. Mughals actually hated the place, and they thought employment in East Bengal was a torture, was a punishment. They thought that it was a kind of a swampy land, always raining. It was a kind of a tropical land. So they never really invested much in developing a good city. They were predominantly a naval power, and pretty much belonged to the riverbank. And then they were primarily interested in two things. One was their own locale, their own houses, palaces, killas, or forts, and so on. Their military presence. They cared about that, and then they cared about tax collection. So they did not really. They were more interested in that tax generation and their own comfort. They did not really invest much in in the urban infrastructure. And the British Raj wasn't any better either. They brought some interesting urban governance issues, municipality in 1860s, and many other sanitation programs and so on. But they did not invest much in the overall kind of a holistic urban vision. They did not embed the DNA of the city with a holistic urban vision. So if you look at the history of Dhaka, even in the early 20th century, the city did not have a vibrant urban culture. It was predominantly rural. So what it means, what I'm trying to argue, that even at the middle of the 20th century, and gradually in the 1960s and 1970s, when all of a sudden, after East Pakistan became Bangladesh, all of a sudden the country found itself in the throes of rapid urbanization without understanding what it means to be urban, what it means to have good urban amenities and so on. And what I'm arguing here is that that confusion led to the kind of the present confusing urban DNA, and which is actually have a long-term climatic implication. Here, just to show you historically that it's a confusing urban pattern that evolved without any kinds of land use planning. Here, I wanted to just show you here, these are the two conflicting forces that is making urbanization today, Dhaka and other cities, very confusing. On the one hand, we have this very agrarian worldview that it is a kind of a wet rice cultivation, the fields and so on, the green fields, the kind of the pastoral Bengal. That is the kind of the dominant outlook of the society. On the other hand, today, if you go to Dhaka and any other cities, Dhaka predominantly, it's a kind of a jungle of buildings with no visible cohesion that you would, a kind of a structural or organizational cohesion that you will find today. Here, just to show you, around the mid-20th century, the kinds of urban-rural population ratio, only Chittagong and Dhaka have had some significant urban population. The rest of the country, even at the middle of the 20th century, was predominantly rural. Just to show you some images here, this is 1880s. Even this scenario did not change even in the 1940s or 1950s. This is Riverside in Buriganga. If you go today, that doesn't exist, of course. It's all is been cannibalized by all kinds of retailers and all kinds of shops and habitations and so on. Chowk Bazaar in the old city during the colonial period. That outlook existed until the middle of the 20th century. Now that has changed, of course. What I'm calling the dream factory, about 2,200 people are pouring into Dhaka city a day. That's a lot of people, right? And this is what you will encounter in Dhaka today. But these kinds of imageries, these kinds of population density, it will give you a kind of an apocalyptic sense of, or it's almost would feel like the end of the world. How do you manage this tempo? How do you manage this growth? How do you sort of provide housing for these people? And that have tremendous implication for the geography, not only of the city, but also of the country. And of course, people are coming because they think that they will get jobs and they will have a better life. So this is a kind of a contradictory place. It comes with both promise and peril. Just to show you, this is the population growth in Dhaka. 1700, only 900,000 people in Dhaka. But it kind of declined when the Mughals left and the British came, the company, East India Company came, and eventually when the British took over in 1857, it was very low. The population was, sunk to as low as 50,000 people sometime around 1840. But it slowly rose until when East Bengal became the capital, Dhaka became the capital of East Bengal in 1905. And it began to rise. But it kind of sort of population was manageable until 1970s, when Bangladesh became, East Pakistan became Bangladesh. All of a sudden, the population began to rise. Sometime in the 1880s, it was just a vertical jump. But if the current population growth continues, by 2030, the population will be roughly about 30 million in an area 2,000 square kilometers. A lot of people. So let me just show you a few images here. When you have so many people in such a congested place, what do you do? Or what do? They start living in slums and squatters. Today, in Dhaka, 30 to 35% of Dhaka's population live in slums in unhygienic, what I call extreme urbanism. Examples of extreme urbanism in extremely unhygienic urban conditions. They are mostly employed in informal sector, primarily rickshaw pulling or brick fields or opportunities that are very, very insecure. 60% of the children are malnourished, 40% have access to safe water. But traditionally, the common discourse on urbanization have seen slums as problem areas. But if you go, I have visited some of these slums in Dhaka and Karail, for example. If you ever go to Dhaka, I would highly recommend going to Karail slum. It's actually a vibrant place. Some of the cooperative, some of the camaraderie, some of the social cohesions that you see in the slum is actually much better than the city at large. And here, just to show you how the slums coexist in a kind of a surreal juxtaposition with the formal sector of the city. In other words, the Karail slum, the largest in Dhaka, is a kind of a shadow city. It's a kind of a parallel city to the parallel entity to the formal city. And they also have their own boating. They have their own cooperative to transfer people across the lakes and so on. And they have created their own niche in the city. Now, let me come to the issues of climate change here now. Why Dhaka? Why we should be concerned about this rampant, unplanned urbanization in Bangladesh? If you look at, this is Dhaka, which is actually defined by 4 major rivers: Buriganga in the south, Turag here, Dhaleshwari, and Shitalakha and Balu, a number of rivers. So Dhaka is actually very sensitive, occupies a very sensitive land-river ecology. So typically, historically, the growth axis was north-south, south-north. So this was the sort of the original city along the northern bank of Buriganga, and the city grew in the northward. But what is happening today is the axis has shifted. The axis is east and west. But the problem is that if you look at these geographical map, east and west are where the very vital wetlands are. That's where water is retained during floods. Those wetlands have historically defined the hydrography of the city. If you lose those wetlands because people want to have lands to build on, that is a problem. Here again, just to show you that the kind of the ecology, the hydrography of the city. If you build here, that means that you are actually threatening not only the city, but also the river system that has defined the country. Here again, just to show you very quickly, just to show you how people are basically occupying lands. And these people, the people who are occupying these lands, they are very powerful, of course. And housing market is, of course, the most vibrant and profitable sector in the country right now. So people are occupying land legally, illegally. All agricultural lands, wetlands surrounding the city are being occupied. Just to show you an example, if you are in Dhaka, you will probably hear about this very powerful business group called Bashundhara. And the Bashundhara people, the Bashundhara group is actually occupying, this is the eastern periphery of the city. That group is occupying a very vital piece of land on the kind of the very ecologically sensitive wetland in the east. So when you occupy, when you fill up that land, you actually destroy the natural drainage system to take the flood water out to the wetland. That's literally happening here. As you can see that wetlands are all disappearing. Just to show you the detail, the canal, that's gone. And you all you have these rather, like Manhattan type grid pattern that's kind of occupying the wetlands. Here, just to show you a few examples, this is what it feels like. Agricultural lands, the surrounding agricultural lands, the low-lying wetlands that kind of define the city, all gone, and what I'm calling the sandy wasteland. It's actually, if you use the Google map, you will see these rather white patches that surround the city. These are all lands occupied legally, illegally, without any consideration whatsoever about the hydrography of the city, the geography that define the city. And here is the utopia. Do you feel that it is Bangladesh? It is actually in Bangladesh, but it might feel Chantilly, right here, or Orange County. That's exactly what's happening. And as you can see, this type of housing is already threatening this very vital north-south river called Balu River. And I suspect that in about 20 years, by 2030, all these rivers will be gone. And here again, what I'm calling the expanding utopia. These buildings are gradually, every time I go back to Bangladesh a couple of times a year, every time I go back, I see the expanding periphery. And they are gradually occupying the rivers, they are occupying wetlands and so on. Just to show you one example, see how the rivers are being colonized, how the rivers are being taken over. And this is how the rivers are all filled up. This is the technique, how the rivers these are, by the way, what I'm saying, that rivers are very important. These rivers are being filled up, so what the land grabbers do, they basically stick bamboos in the riverbed, and after a while, after observing the mobility of the authority, and they would just fill up the area with sand, and they will claim it theirs. This is how things are done. This is happening right in front of the authority, that boats bring sands, and basically the river is filled up. And according to one study, 1/3 of Buriganga, that's sort of the Indus or Nile of Dhaka, 1/3 of the width has been filled up. Here, Shitalakha, which is here, and look at this the river is being filled up. Here again, river being filled up. Now, let me show you one other example. The brick empire. Dhaka has become a brick empire. But where does the brick come from? The bricks actually come from brick fields that are occupying all the wetlands around the city. And as you can see here, this is the area where you see all these brick fields. If you go to Dhaka today, as the plane lands in Dhaka, in the international airport, you will see how the city is surrounded by brick fields. There are two major pollutants for the city. One is the brick field, the other is the vehicular gas emission. Here again, but how do these brick fields run? They run on trees that are cut from the forest and so on. So brick fields are also causing building boom. Brick fields are causing a wide-scale deforestation in the country. I'm going to go a bit fast. Water and river pollution, as you can see from here, the rivers are pretty much dead. In order for a living organism to survive in water, it requires about 4 millimeter of dissolved oxygen. And studies have shown that rivers surrounding Dhaka do not have that required dissolved oxygen in water. That means that no fish, it's virtually, the rivers are virtually dead. And industrial wastes are being dumped into the rivers directly. Here again, just to show you how rivers are, industrial waste from tanneries, fertilizers, and all kinds of chemical companies are, industrial wastes are being dumped into the river directly. Here again, water pollution, and as you can see, this is the quality of water. And this is not really different from many Western countries. America had these river issues in the 1960s, and as you know, the Clean Water Act was enacted during President Nixon's time in 1970. So here, just to show you that this is the quality of river, industrial waste being dumped. So another issue here is another pollutant is the vehicles. Traffic congestion, if you go to Dhaka today, you will feel it, the paralyzing effect of traffic congestion. But that's not really different from Western metropolises. 1920s, New York was somewhat similar. 1930s, London was somewhat similar. But they managed to recover the cities from the clutches of automobiles. So why traffic congestion, overpopulation, lack of efficient public transportation, dedicated lanes, dominance of private cars, inefficient enforcement of traffic laws, absence of coordination among city administration agencies, lack of a strong will. If you want to buy a car, you have to pay 200% tax on the price of the car. But that's a very good incentive for the government not to ban the import of private cars. Do you see the point? So government is very reluctant to stop importing cars. So 220 registered cars are entering the streets of Dhaka every day. And one car emits about 20-pound carbon by burning 1 pound of gasoline. So now think about it. 20 cars, 100 cars will emit how much greenhouse gas into the environment in the span of one day. This is regular Dhaka, kind of apocalyptic. But this is Dhaka during the Eid festival. So what it means is that it's manageable, it's controllable. You can actually solve the problem if you have the political will. It actually looks pretty nice, doesn't it? It actually looks pretty nice. And so my point here is that it's actually quite solvable. And if you have the political will, and you can actually lower the greenhouse gas emission in the city quite significantly by managing traffic. So a vital lesson to be learned that the city, I'm not going to read it, cities are a vital weapon against climate change, insecurities, and vulnerabilities. So what can we do about Dhaka? Very quickly, I'm not going to spend much time. Decentralization is a must. You have to help develop other cities in the country so that people will not just come to this city. Urban growth boundary. Many cities, many metropolises in the world have used the concept of urban growth boundary, that you stop the growth. And there are all kinds of ways. Public transportation, that is a must to manage the city and growth and air pollution and so on, and the life of the city. Deplot, I'm going to explain in a minute. Recalibrate urban governance, environmental literacy, which is a must. People do not know what it means to be urban, and it actually gets filtered into the policy mindset. Innovations. We have to innovate relentlessly in the sector of sustainable urbanism. Decentralization. I have written recently about the concept of split capital. We should even be ready to split the capital, just like in Holland, in the Netherlands. Amsterdam is the ceremonial capital, but The Hague is where the urban, the capital functions. We should even be prepared to split the capital. Reverse domestic brain drain. What happens this is my own experience. If you are here in Chittagong, if you are in Rajshahi or Khulna, your first goal would be to migrate to Dhaka in order to have a better life. Even if you are a middle class, even if you are wealthy and you are not a climate refugee or so on. So we'll talk about these explosive urban growth, and we have to really, and you can see from here that how disproportionate this circle is the growth of Dhaka, and it's so disproportionate to other cities of the country. We have to really decentralize. And here, what I'm saying is that central threat, if Dhaka is let to grow unchecked, it will eventually threaten the very river system. Even the Ganges will be threatened by 2030. And of course, this is a speculation that if you disturb that very sensitive river system, you actually begin to see all kinds of new patterns of flooding. So the landmass disappearance will not have to come from the south, actually come from the north. And so what we need to do is we have to have a very strong sense of urban boundary, reclaiming wetlands and green areas, and the government needs to take control of wetlands and very vulnerable agricultural lands and stop the growth. And this is already being done in Paris, by the way, and in many other metropolises, because that kind of growth, that kind of speed is simply unsustainable. Mass transit, we have to invest in mass transit, low investment, high yielding. Oftentimes, political parties, political government thinks that these kinds of iconic investment, flyovers or expressways, are the solution. But I would like to argue that actually low investment, high yielding solutions like investing in buses, mass transit, that would be the type of investment we should do. And just to give you an example, if you occupy low occupancy vehicles, the street, this is what the street would look like. But take the same number of people in a bus, this would look like. Just to give you some examples very quickly, these are some of the innovation we should be doing. Vertical roads that in Bangladesh, a land-scarce country, we should not think roads as one-storied. The roads should be actually considered multi-storied. That means not only double-deckers, but also gender-articulated buses, so that we can take half the load of the street. Because oftentimes, because of the kind of the nature of culture, nature of society, women are oftentimes kind of inhibited to get into public modes of transportation. We can actually address those kinds of issues. Development is a state of the mind. So we can think about all kinds of multimodal transportation. And that's already happening, but in the informal sector, to transport sort of slum people across the lake. So that's already happening. Can we make it formal? Can we bring it to the formal sector? Deplot. Oftentimes, we impose the kind of the agrarian, the division of agricultural lands onto urban areas. And that has to stop. And as you can see here, the plots are the killer of this urban city. If this is what's happening in Dhaka right now, individual buildings, and these are negative spaces that creates heat island. But if you combine all the houses together, we actually free up a lot of space. That's exactly what was done in a place like Manhattan, with same kind of urban density. In Manhattan, you can see that housing estate rather than single-family houses. Here, some innovations in sustainable urbanism. We can actually supplant an agro-urbanism into the city. You know, the roof not only become green roof, they can also actually become patches of agriculture. And then renewable energy could be part of this, So finally, what I'm going to say is that there has to be a revolution in the policy imagination. Depoliticize the environment. Environment has been deeply politicized. The government, the political leadership acts as long as it gives some political dividends. or in terms of votes and so on. They would not invest in long-term projects. But cities are not short-term projects. You have to have a long-term vision. So we have to depoliticize the environment, demand mitigation rather than supply efficiency, which is to say that we are constantly thinking about supplying the product. But how about asking you to stop demanding? How about asking you to not have 2 cars? How about asking you to get on the public mode of transportation and stop that demand, stop that efficiency, supply efficiency, rather than asking you to stop demanding more? Public participation in natural resources. One of the main reasons why we are losing rivers and wetlands is that these are not monitored. People are just dumping sands and occupying lands. If you can bring people into the wetland, into the rivers by means of river transportation and so on, if you create a sense of a culture of public vigilance of these natural resources, you can actually protect them. People will rise up if their river is being wasted and destroyed. Environmental literacy from the primary school. This is a fundamental policy revolution that needs to occur in Bangladesh. Access, not mobility. We are always thinking about going from place to place fast. That's not what we should be thinking of. We should be thinking of access to buildings rather than going to that building fast. And social justice, unless you have this equitable distribution of resources, a city is not going to function. And finally, urban governance. I want to leave you with this image, is that cities are growing. That's the future of the world. Urbanization is the future of the world. How can we deal with climate change vulnerabilities? I would like to argue that sustainable cities are the best tools to deal with climate change vulnerabilities and insecurities. Sustainable cities equal to good climatic adaptation. Thank you very much.
Okay, I would like to take a few questions before we break. In the interest of time, I'd like to bundle them together. So we're going to have microphones going around. If we could have a show of hands, and please keep your question brief and let it be one question, not 4 or 2. So let's see a show of hands. Okay, let's take a question over here, and then we'll take one on this side of the room. So these 2 right here. Please wait for the mic. And actually, the third question, the gentleman right in front of you, yeah.
Regarding rivers, the regional rivers, we hear a lot about Ganges and Tista, but I think the bigger threat that I know of is actually China occupied Tibet so that they can divert Brahmaputra. That's one of the theories. What is happening to Brahmaputra now? Is China going ahead with the dam to divert the whole river? Does anybody know? I mean, that would be a more devastating impact than any other river redirection in Asia.
Okay, let's hear your question, sir, right here. Yeah, just wait for the mic.
Thank you. I'm Osman Farooq, former Education Minister of Bangladesh. In your example, I'm part of the fragile political system. But prior to that, I was at the World Bank here for almost 30 years. I don't know whether it's a question or a comment, you see. On the climate change issues, I think very articulated way all the issues have been presented. But basically what you are predicting as the effect on Bangladesh 20 years down the road is already experiencing because of the question of sharing of international waters, which was just mentioned about here. The Ganges barrage has really affected a vast part of the southwestern region, and water resource sharing has become one of the major issues. With China building a dam, it's becoming even more international. So my question is, the issues that have been raised are well known, basically it can be articulated, but as an international community, what has been done to ensure that the water sharing issues between lower riparian and upper riparian rivers are being addressed You have all sorts of sanctions against various countries on various reasons, but the international community doesn't seem to be moving in that directions. So we talk about climate change problems, but climate change effects which are now being instituted, which are now being affected in Bangladesh through arbitrary natures, has not been addressed. So I think that should be addressed. On the question of urbanization, I fully agree that Bangladesh lacks not only an urbanization policy, but also a land utilization policy, land use policy is in there. And finally, despite all of this, the country has been growing economy has been growing at 6.5%. Production has been brought down to 30% of the total population. And despite everything being non-functional, there are some good things which is going on in the country. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's take those two questions first, and then you will be on deck.
Well, about the Brahmaputra River, I don't know for fact, but only thing I know is from reading the newspaper and the journal articles. When it comes to China, as you know, it's not a very open society. They don't really want to share the information. But only reason they are forced to share some information because of India's involvement. Very ironically, India is a lower riparian country when it comes to Brahmaputra. And if you read some of the newspaper in India, they are saying, Indians are arguing that Bangladesh should join forces with India to protest against China's proposed withdrawal from Brahmaputra. How ironic. You know, they are doing it for so many years to all of our rivers, and then Bangladesh, lower riparian, they very conveniently forget that. Now that Brahmaputra is being threatened, so they are demanding from the Chinese authorities some documents. And what I read, since India at very high level, at the prime minister level, they are demanding some information, China agreed to share some information, most likely with India, but not necessarily with Bangladesh, because they don't see this as an ecological integrated water resources management system, as a basin, like it should be in Mekong Delta or Susquehanna River Basin Commission, for example, meaning watershed or basins are natural neighborhood, so to speak. But that is not being practiced about all rivers. So we hope that some people from the international community, as Dr. Farooq pointed out, what are being done. Not much really. UN Convention on Non-Navigational River is a convention, but India is not a signatory to it. So as far as Brahmaputra is concerned, I think since India is involved, maybe they will get some information, but I doubt that they will share with Bangladesh. If they did, it would be good.
Coming back to Brahmaputra issue a little later, but first I would rather dwell on the issue of the political perspective that you have brought in, what the international community is doing. Let me turn the table to the Bangladeshi policymakers. What exactly are they doing? Because over the last 30 years, they have failed to provide a united front, politicize the whole issue, and dealt the issue in a very partisan basis. I understand it sounds very sour, but there's the fact of life, that what the Bangladeshi community, Bangladeshi policymakers, whenever they went into power, they made practically their policy, the cornerstone of their policy is non-transparency. Look at the TISTA deal that was about to be signed. Absolutely nobody had been consulted. Nobody knew. Even the cabinet was not consulted what the government is going to sign. And so given that, and it's not exactly the a defining characteristic or just something unique to Awami League. It happened during the BNP regime. Let's be very frank to this. So unless Bangladeshi community, Bangladeshi policymakers can come up with a very clear, precise national interest-based policy towards India and work with it and create a basic political platform, they are going to be treated badly, and international community will stand by and watch. Let us not claim that international community is going to do something unless Bangladeshis can do it by themselves. I know it doesn't sound good, but that is harsh reality. Going back to Brahmaputra issue, of course, I'm not a river expert. I would refer back to the one book, which a copy I see in front of me, The Water, the Next Asian War. That is why when I put out those three countries, India, Bangladesh, and China, why? because there has to be, and Bangladesh needs to demand that one and work through, yes, international fora, but with China as well. Looking into the Bangladesh foreign policy, which tries to somehow bypass China or only bring in China at a time when necessary. These are political issues. Of course, there are environmental aspects, but this is a political decision Bangladeshi leadership will have to do.
One of the comments that were made by Dr. Farouk is of course, yes, we are greatly inspired, and we always hear about these heroic stories, heroic narratives of annual growth rate 6.5 and expected to rise to 7% not too far in the future. But what we don't hear from the political leadership and policymakers is that growth is also accompanied by its rather vicious alter ego, the environmental pollution. China, with its stunning growth rate, produces 6.2 billion tons of CO2 a year, followed by the US, 6 billion tons a year. But what we don't hear in the context of Bangladesh is that what kind of environmental wreckage that is happening alongside these environmental growth. So what I am arguing here is that there has to be a policy revolution, that these two things, environmental growth and economic growth and environmental stewardship should go hand in hand. Why? Because Bangladesh cannot afford to lose 1 square inch of its land, because it's a land scarce land that cannot afford to dilly-dally with its land mass and its environment.
All right, last question of this session will be right over here.
Hello, can you hear me? Is this on? Yeah, okay. I'm Ed Barry with the Sustainable World Initiative, and I can't help but feeling like there's an elephant in the room that we're not talking about. And that elephant is basically that Bangladesh is a relatively small country, as you've acknowledged, but there are 150 million people crowded into this space that only has 35 million hectares of equivalent bioproductivity. Compare that to the United States with 1.5 billion hectares. So there's a fundamental balancing issue here between levels of population and the resource capacity. So I would ask the question, in your revolution in the policy imagination, how about including a population policy that makes sense to be in balance with the resources of the country?
Only if I had 20 more minutes, I would have come to that. And of course, when I said decentralization should figure very prominently, is what I did not elaborate on, is that it has to be, decentralization would have to be aggressively married to a population control policy, which is being done, as you would know, in the 1980s and in the 1990s. There was a very stunning population control success in Bangladesh, but somehow it was forgotten in the late 90s and in the past 1 decade or so. So I think decentralization, the idea of decentralization is, there is although I did not highlight it too much, but the idea of population control is embedded in the idea of decentralization, I think.
Incidentally, the first speaker in the next panel will be talking about this very issue, so you and others should stay tuned for that. Well, we're going to take a break for about 15 minutes, but please come back. Oh, yes, thank you.